Little girl whispered something that changed everything, and not even the toughest detective could hold back his tears. But what had gone so terribly wrong inside that orphanage? Follow the clues and discover the truth hidden beneath the falling snow. Thank you so much for watching and for all your comments. Let me know at the end if you liked the story and where you're watching from and why you're following this. The December wind howled through the narrow streets of Boston, carrying with it the scent of coal smoke and the distant sound of church bells marking the evening hour. Detective James Sullivan stood before the weathered brownstone on Beacon Hill, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid air as he studied the building that had become the center of his latest investigation. The year was 1897, and the city wore its winter coat with the same dignified bearing it had maintained for centuries, gas lamps flickering to life along the cobblestone streets as darkness descended upon the bustling metropolis. James was a tall man, standing well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders that spoke of both strength and the weight of responsibility he carried. His dark hair, touched with premature silver at the temples, framed a face marked by intelligence and a quiet intensity that made criminals uneasy and witnesses eager to cooperate. At 32 years of age, he had already built a reputation as one of Boston's most capable detectives, known for his methodical approach and unwavering dedication to justice. Yet tonight, as he climbed the stone steps to the orphanage door, he felt an unusual heaviness in his chest that had nothing to do with the cold. The letter had arrived at the precinct 3 days earlier, penned in an elegant hand that betrayed both education and desperation. It spoke of missing donations, of children who would go without Christmas, of a mystery that seemed to have no rational explanation. The director of St. Catherine's Home for Children had exhausted all other options before turning to the police, and even then she had done so with reluctance, fearing the scandal that might follow. James raised his gloved hand and knocked firmly on the heavy oak door. The sound echoed through the quiet street, and for a moment there was only silence. Then came the soft footfalls from within, the gentle click of a lock being turned, and the door opened to reveal a young woman whose beauty struck him with unexpected force. She stood in the warm glow of the entrance hall, her auburn hair pulled back in a simple but elegant style that revealed the graceful curve of her neck. Her eyes, a remarkable shade of green that reminded him of spring leaves, studied him with a mixture of curiosity and concern. She wore a modest dress of deep blue wool, appropriate for her position, yet unable to hide the natural elegance of her bearing. There was something in her face that spoke of both gentleness and strength, a combination that James found instantly compelling. "Detective Sullivan?" she asked, her voice carrying the refined accent of someone well-educated, yet warmed by genuine concern. "We've been expecting you. Please come in from the cold." "Thank you," James replied, removing his hat as he stepped into the entrance hall. The interior of the orphanage was surprisingly warm and well-maintained, though he could see the signs of careful economy in every corner. The wooden floors were polished to a shine through labor rather than luxury, and the decorations, while cheerful, were clearly handmade and repurposed year after year. "I'm Miss Clara Bennett," the young woman said, closing the door against the winter wind. "I serve as the assistant director here at St. Catherine's, and I help manage the children's education and daily activities. Mrs. Pemberton, our director, asked me to meet with you. She's attending to some matters with the younger children at the moment." James found himself studying her face more closely than was perhaps proper, noting the intelligence that shone in those remarkable eyes, the slight worry line between her brows that suggested she carried the weight of the orphanage's troubles personally. "I understand there have been some unusual circumstances regarding donations intended for the children's Christmas celebration." Clara's expression darkened with concern, and she gestured toward a small office off the main hallway. "Please come this way. I can explain everything we know, though I fear it isn't much." She led him into a modest room lined with ledgers and filing cabinets, a single desk positioned near a window that looked out onto the gaslit street. A small fire burned in the grate, providing welcome warmth against the December chill. As they settled into their seats, James on a wooden chair facing the desk and Clara behind it, he withdrew a leather notebook from his coat pocket. "Perhaps you could start from the beginning, Miss Bennett. When did you first notice something was amiss?" Clara folded her hands on the desk, and he noticed they trembled slightly before she steadied them with visible effort. "It began approximately 6 weeks ago, in early November. St. Catherine's has several benefactors who traditionally provide donations during the autumn months to ensure the children have a proper Christmas celebration. These aren't wealthy individuals, Detective Sullivan, but good people of modest means who give what they can to help children who have so little. And these donations failed to arrive? James asked, his pen poised over his notebook. Not exactly, Clara said, her brow furrowing with confusion. That's what makes this so particularly troubling. The donations were sent. We have confirmation of that from the donors themselves. Several of them have contacted us personally, concerned that we hadn't acknowledged their generosity. But we never received a single penny of what they sent. James leaned forward with interest. How were these donations sent? Through the postal service? Through various means, Clara explained, rising from her chair and moving to a filing cabinet. She withdrew a folder and returned to the desk, spreading several documents before him. Some were sent by post, others delivered by messenger services, and a few were meant to be hand-delivered by the donors themselves. Yet none of them reached us. It's as though the money simply vanished between the sending and the receiving. James examined the documents carefully, noting the names of the donors, the amounts that should have been received, and the dates when the donations had supposedly been dispatched. This is quite substantial, he observed, tallying the figures mentally. Nearly $300 in total. That's a considerable sum. It represents everything the children would have had for Christmas, Clara said softly, and he heard the catch in her voice. New shoes for those whose feet have outgrown their old ones, warm coats, a proper Christmas dinner with roasted turkey and all the trimmings, small gifts and toys, oranges and peppermint sticks. Nothing extravagant, you understand, but things that would have made them feel remembered and valued during this season. The emotion in her voice touched something in James that he usually kept carefully guarded when working a case. He looked up from the documents to find her gazing out the window at the darkening street, her profile illuminated by the warm glow of the desk lamp. You care for them a great deal, he said quietly. Clara turned back to him, and he saw her eyes had grown bright with unshed tears. I was one of them once, Detective Sullivan. I lived in this very orphanage from the age of 8 until I was 18. Mrs. Pemberton saw to it that I received an education, that I learned to be more than circumstances might have dictated. When I completed my schooling, she offered me a position here, and I accepted gladly. These children are my family, and I understand all too well what it means to feel forgotten by the world. James felt his chest tighten at her words, at the vulnerability and strength she displayed in equal measure. Then we shall ensure they are not forgotten this Christmas, Miss Bennet. I give you my word on that. He returned his attention to the documents, though he found his focus challenged by her presence. Have there been any other unusual occurrences at the orphanage? Anyone behaving suspiciously, perhaps new staff members or regular visitors who might have had access to information about the expected donations? Clara considered this carefully, her fingers drumming lightly on the desk in a gesture that betrayed her concentration. We have very few staff members, Detective. Mrs. Pemberton and myself, a cook named Mrs. O'Brien, who has been with us for 15 years, and a groundskeeper, Mr. Fletcher, who is nearly 70 and has worked here even longer. As for visitors, we have a few volunteers who come to help with lessons and activities, all of them respectable members of various church congregations who have been thoroughly vetted. What about delivery people, postal workers, anyone who might have regular access to the building? James pressed, making notes as they spoke. The same postman has served this route for years, Mr. Davies, and he's known to be utterly reliable, Clara said. As for other deliveries, they vary, but we've had no new faces that I can recall. She paused, a thought seeming to occur to her. Though there is one thing, perhaps insignificant. In investigations, Miss Bennet, nothing is insignificant, James said, meeting her eyes across the desk. Please, share whatever comes to mind. Clara rose and moved to the window, her figure silhouetted against the gaslight from the street. About 2 months ago, just before the donations began going missing, a man came to the orphanage inquiring about our operations. He said he was interested in making a substantial contribution and wanted to understand how we managed our finances and distributed resources to the children. James felt a prickle of interest at the base of his neck, the instinct that told him he'd stumbled onto something significant. Did this man give a name? He introduced himself as Mr. Harrison Blackwell, Clara said, turning back to face him. He was well-dressed, spoke with refinement, and seemed genuinely interested in our work. Mrs. Pemberton and I gave him a tour of the facility, explained our budget and our needs. He took extensive notes, asked very detailed questions about our donors, and how contributions were typically made. And did he ever make the substantial donation he spoke of? James asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. Clara shook her head slowly. We never heard from him again. At the time, we thought perhaps he had simply changed his mind or found another charity more worthy of his support. But now, in light of everything that's happened, I find myself wondering if his interest was not philanthropic at all. James stood, tucking his notebook into his coat. Do you remember anything else about this Mr. Blackwell? His appearance? Any distinctive features? Perhaps where he claimed to be from? Clara closed her eyes, clearly trying to recall every detail. He was of average height, perhaps in his 40s, with dark hair beginning to gray. He wore spectacles with gold frames and carried a walking stick with a silver handle, though he didn't appear to need it for support. His accent suggested education, possibly Harvard or Yale, though I couldn't say with certainty. He mentioned no specific residence, only that he had recently become interested in charitable work after the passing of a family member. That's excellent detail, Miss Bennet, James said with genuine admiration. You have quite an observant eye. A slight flush colored her cheeks at the compliment. When one has spent years as a ward of charity, Detective Sullivan, one learns to pay attention to potential benefactors. Their generosity can mean the difference between hunger and sustenance, cold and warmth. Their eyes met and held for a moment that stretched beyond what was strictly professional, and James felt something shift in his chest, a connection forming that he hadn't anticipated. He cleared his throat gently, returning to the matter at hand. I'd like to speak with some of your donors directly, verify the details of how they sent their contributions. Would you be able to provide me with their addresses? Of course, Clara said, moving back to the filing cabinet. I have all that information compiled here. As she bent to retrieve another folder, they heard the sound of children's voices raised in song from somewhere deeper in the building. The melody was recognizable, a Christmas carol being practiced with more enthusiasm than precision. James found himself drawn to the doorway, listening to the young voices. How many children currently reside at St. Catherine's? 23 at present, Clara replied, joining him at the door with the folder in hand. Ranging in age from 4 to 15. Most have lost their parents to illness or accident. A few were simply abandoned, left on our doorstep with nothing but the clothes they wore. Her voice grew softer, sadder. They're good children, Detective Sullivan. They deserve better than disappointment on Christmas morning. They'll have their Christmas, Miss Bennet, James said firmly, taking the folder from her hands. Their fingers brushed briefly in the exchange, and he felt an unexpected warmth spread through him at the contact. I promise you that. Clara looked up at him, hope and gratitude mingling in her expression. Thank you, Detective. Your kindness means more than you know. She walked him back to the entrance hall, where she retrieved his hat from the stand by the door. Will you be returning tomorrow? Yes, James said, settling his hat on his head. I'll begin interviewing the donors first thing in the morning, but I'd like to come back here in the afternoon if that's convenient. I want to examine the areas where deliveries are typically received, speak with your staff, and get a better sense of the orphanage's daily operations. We'll be expecting you, Clara said, opening the door. The cold air rushed in, and she wrapped her arms around herself against the chill. Detective Sullivan, may I ask you something? Of course, he replied, pausing on the threshold. She hesitated, as though weighing whether to give voice to her thoughts. Do you believe we'll recover the money? Or at least discover what happened to it? I need to know whether I should begin preparing the children for disappointment. James looked at her standing in the warm light of the entrance hall, this remarkable young woman who had overcome her own difficult past to dedicate herself to helping others, and he felt a surge of determination unlike anything he'd experienced in his years of police work. Miss Bennet, I have never failed to solve a case I've undertaken, and I don't intend to start now. Whatever has happened to those donations, wherever that money has gone, I will find it. The children of St. Catherine's will have their Christmas. A smile broke across Clara's face, transforming her features with a radiance that made James's breath catch in his throat. Then I shall sleep easier tonight, Detective Sullivan. Thank you, and Godspeed in your investigation. As James descended the stone steps and turned his collar up against the wind, he found himself thinking not of the case alone, but of the extraordinary woman he'd just met. Clara Bennet had awakened something in him that had lain dormant for far too long, a capacity for connection that his work had led him to neglect. He walked through the gaslit streets of Boston with purpose in his stride, determined not only to solve this mystery but to prove himself worthy of the trust she had placed in him. The city stretched out before him in the gathering darkness, its secrets waiting to be uncovered, and James Sullivan felt more alive than he had in years. The morning arrived with a pale sun struggling to break through the thick clouds that hung over Boston like a gray shroud. James had spent much of the night reviewing the documents Clara had provided, comparing names and dates, searching for patterns that might reveal the truth behind the missing donations. He had risen before dawn, dressed in his finest suit, a charcoal gray that spoke of professionalism and authority, and set out to conduct his interviews. The first donor on his list was a Mrs. Adelaide Thornton, a widow who lived in a modest home near the Common. She received him in her parlor, a small room filled with photographs and memories of better days. Mrs. Thornton was in her 60s, with kind eyes that crinkled at the corners when she smiled, though James could see the worry that clouded them when he explained the reason for his visit. "I sent $20 by post on November 5th, she told him, wringing a handkerchief in her weathered hands. "It was everything I could spare from my late husband's pension, but those children needed it more than I needed new curtains or an extra cord of wood. I received no acknowledgement from the orphanage, which struck me as odd, so I wrote to them inquiring if the donation had been received. That's when I learned it had never arrived." James made careful notes, asking about the specific post office where she had sent the money, whether she had requested any special handling or insurance. "Did anyone know you were making this donation, Mrs. Thornton? Perhaps someone you mentioned it to in conversation?" The elderly woman thought carefully, her brow furrowed in concentration. "I may have mentioned it to my neighbor, Mrs. Walsh, and perhaps to the grocer when I was explaining why I was being more careful with my purchases. Oh, and there was a young man who came around asking about charitable contributions, said he was conducting a survey for some municipal office. I told him about my intention to donate to St. Catherine's." James felt that familiar prickle of interest again. "Can you describe this young man? When exactly did he visit you?" "It was late October, perhaps the 28th or 29th, Mrs. Thornton recalled. "He was well-spoken, carried a leather portfolio, and wore a decent suit. He had dark hair, spectacles with gold frames, and I remember thinking he looked like someone's educated nephew trying to make his way in the world." The description matched what Clara had told him about Harrison Blackwell, though Mrs. Thornton's visitor had been described as younger. James continued his rounds throughout the morning, visiting 5 more donors, and a disturbing pattern began to emerge. Each of them had been visited by someone conducting surveys or asking questions about charitable giving in the weeks before they sent their donations. The descriptions varied slightly, some reporting an older gentleman, others a younger man, but certain details remained consistent: the spectacles with gold frames, the leather portfolio, the refined manner of speaking. By the time James arrived back at St. Catherine's that afternoon, his mind was working through several theories, each more troubling than the last. Clara met him at the door, her face brightening when she saw him, a reaction that sent an unexpected warmth through his chest despite the cold December air. "Detective Sullivan, welcome back," she said, stepping aside to allow him entry. "I've been anxious to hear if your interviews revealed anything useful." "They did indeed, Miss Bennet," James replied, removing his hat and coat. "Is there somewhere private we might speak? I have several questions, and I'd like to examine any correspondence the orphanage has received over the past few months." Clara led him once again to the small office, where a fresh fire had been laid in the grate. The warmth was welcome after hours of walking through the cold streets, and James found himself grateful for her thoughtfulness. As they settled into their seats, he noticed she had prepared tea, the pot steaming gently on the desk beside 2 cups. "I hope you don't mind," she said, pouring for both of them. "I thought you might appreciate something warm after being out in this weather all morning." "That's very kind of you," James said, accepting the cup with genuine appreciation. Their fingers brushed again during the exchange, and he saw a faint blush rise in her cheeks before she quickly looked away. "Miss Bennet, I need you to think very carefully about something. In the weeks before the donations began disappearing, did anyone else visit the orphanage asking questions about your operations? Anyone besides this Mr. Blackwell you mentioned yesterday?" Clara cupped her hands around her tea, steam rising between them as she considered his question. "There was a woman, actually. I had forgotten about her until you asked just now. She came approximately 3 weeks before Mr. Blackwell, in early October." She said she was writing an article for a ladies' magazine about charitable institutions in Boston and wanted to feature St. Catherine's. James leaned forward intently. Did she give a name? Did you see any credentials? She introduced herself as Miss Victoria Hartley, and she did show me a card from the magazine, though I confess I didn't examine it closely, Clara said, worry creeping into her voice. She asked many of the same questions that Mr. Blackwell later asked about our donors, our funding, how contributions were typically made. Detective Sullivan, do you think these people were working together? I believe we're dealing with a coordinated scheme, James said gravely. Every donor I spoke with this morning reported being visited by someone asking about their charitable activities shortly before they sent their donations. These visitors gathered intelligence, learned exactly when and how the money would be sent, and then intercepted it before it could reach you. Clara's face paled, and she set down her teacup with a trembling hand. But how is such a thing possible? How could they intercept postal deliveries and private messengers without detection? That's what I intend to discover, James assured her. May I see any correspondence the orphanage has received over the past few months? Letters from donors, business communications, anything that might have passed through your hands. Clara rose and moved to the filing cabinet, withdrawing a thick folder of letters. We keep everything organized by date. These are all the letters we've received since September. She brought the folder back to the desk, and they began sorting through the correspondence together, their heads bent close over the papers. As they worked, James found himself acutely aware of Clara's presence, the subtle scent of lavender that clung to her hair, the concentration evident in her delicate features as she examined each letter. Several times their hands brushed as they reached for the same document, and each time he felt that same unexpected warmth, that sense of connection that seemed to grow stronger with each passing moment. Look at this, Clara said suddenly, holding up a letter dated November 2nd. This is from Mr. Henry Morrison, one of our donors. He writes that he'll be sending his annual contribution of $30 by messenger on November 10th. But look at the postmark on the envelope. James examined it closely, his trained eye catching what had alarmed her. This was postmarked November 4th, but the letter itself is dated November 2nd. That's suspicious timing. And here's another, Clara said, pulling out more letters. And another. Detective Sullivan, someone has been intercepting our mail, reading it, and then sending it on to us after they've learned what they needed to know. The pieces were falling into place now, forming a picture of elaborate fraud and careful planning. They needed to know when donations were coming and how they would arrive, James said, his mind racing through the implications. By intercepting your incoming correspondence, they could stay one step ahead, position themselves to steal the money before it reached you. A sound from the hallway made them both look up. Mrs. Pemberton, the orphanage director, stood in the doorway. She was a stout woman in her late 50s, with iron-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes that had seen too much hardship to be easily shocked. Miss Bennet, forgive the interruption. The children are asking after you for their evening lessons. Of course, Mrs. Pemberton, Clara said, rising from her chair. Detective Sullivan and I were just reviewing some correspondence. May I introduce you properly? Detective, this is Mrs. Pemberton, our director. James stood and offered a respectful bow. Ma'am, it's an honor to meet you. Miss Bennet has spoken highly of your dedication to these children. Mrs. Pemberton's stern expression softened slightly. And she has spoken of you as well, Detective Sullivan. She tells me you've given your word that the children will have their Christmas. I pray you're a man who keeps his promises. I am, ma'am, James said firmly. I'm beginning to understand the scope of what we're dealing with, and I promise you, I will see this through to the end. The director nodded approvingly, then turned to Clara. The children are in the study hall, dear. I'll stay with the detective if he has further questions for me. Clara hesitated, clearly torn between her duties and her desire to remain involved in the investigation. James caught her eye and gave a slight nod. Go ahead, Miss Bennet. I'll brief you on everything when you return. Perhaps we might continue our discussion this evening. Yes, I'd like that very much, Clara said, her eyes lingering on his for a moment before she gathered her skirts and hurried from the room. Mrs. Pemberton settled into the chair Clara had vacated, studying James with shrewd eyes. You care for her, she stated bluntly, not as a question, but as an observation. James felt heat rise in his face, unused to having his emotions so plainly identified. Mrs. Pemberton, I assure you my interest is purely professional.
Detective Sullivan, I've been running this orphanage for 30 years, and I've learned to read people with considerable accuracy. the older woman said, a hint of amusement in her stern features. I see the way you look at her, and I see the way she speaks of you.
I'm not criticizing, young man. Clara Bennett is the finest young woman I've ever known, and she deserves happiness. But she's also been hurt before, by a man who made promises he didn't keep. So I'll ask you plainly, are you a man of integrity? James met her gaze steadily, understanding the importance of this moment. Mrs. Pemberton, I cannot predict what the future holds, but I can tell you this. I've never met anyone quite like Miss Bennett, and I would never do anything to cause her pain. My first priority is solving this case and ensuring these children have their Christmas. But I won't deny that I find her remarkable, and if circumstances allow, I would very much like to know her better. The director studied him for a long moment, then nodded with satisfaction. That's an honest answer, and I appreciate honesty. Now then, what else can I tell you about our operations here that might help your investigation? They spent the next hour discussing the orphanage's daily routines, the patterns of deliveries and visitors, anything that might provide a clue to how the thieves had operated. Mrs. Pemberton proved to be an invaluable source of information, her keen mind recalling details that others might have overlooked. As evening approached and gas lamps were lit throughout the building, Clara returned to find James and Mrs. Pemberton deep in discussion. The children are settled for dinner, she reported. Have you made progress? We have indeed, James said, rising from his chair. Mrs. Pemberton has been extraordinarily helpful, but I think it's time I examined the areas where deliveries are typically received. Would you show me, Miss Bennett? Clara led him through the orphanage, pointing out the front entrance where postal deliveries were left, the side door where merchants made their deliveries, and the small office where Mrs. Pemberton typically received visitors. As they walked, James studied every detail, looking for weaknesses in security, ways someone might have gained unauthorized access. They ended their tour in the entrance hall, where children's voices could be heard from the dining room, raised in prayer before their evening meal. Clara paused, listening to the familiar ritual, and James saw tears glisten in her eyes. What troubles you, Miss Bennett? He asked gently. She turned to him, and in the soft glow of the gas lamps, her face was achingly beautiful. I keep thinking of what one of the little girls said to me yesterday. Her name is Sophie. She's only 6 years old. She took my hand and said, "We were good this year, but Santa forgot us." I had to look away to hide my tears, Detective Sullivan. How do you explain to a child that it wasn't Santa who forgot them, but that someone deliberately stole what should have been theirs? James felt something break open in his chest at her words, at the raw emotion in her voice. Without thinking, he reached out and took her hand in his, a gesture that crossed the boundaries of professional conduct, but felt entirely right in that moment. You won't have to explain that to her, Clara. I give you my word, on everything I hold sacred, those children will have their Christmas. She looked down at their joined hands, then back up at his face, and he saw something shift in her expression, a softening, a recognition of the connection that had been growing between them since the moment they'd met. I believe you, James, she whispered, using his given name for the first time. I don't know why, but I trust you completely. They stood there in the dimly lit hall, hands clasped, the sounds of the orphanage settling in for the evening around them. James knew he should release her hand, step back, maintain the professional distance his position required, but he couldn't bring himself to break this moment, this connection that felt more real and significant than anything he'd experienced in his 32 years. Finally, reluctantly, he let her hand slip from his. I should go, he said quietly. I have more investigating to do, and you have your duties here. But may I return tomorrow evening? I believe I'm close to understanding how this scheme operated, and I'll need your help to spring the trap I'm planning. Of course, Clara said, her voice slightly breathless. I'll be waiting for you. James collected his hat and coat, but paused at the door. Clara, he said, turning back to her. When this is over, when the children have their Christmas and justice has been served, might I call on you? Not as a detective, but as a man who would very much like to know you better. Her smile was radiant, transforming the dim hallway with its warmth. I would like that very much, James. Very much indeed. As he walked through the cold December night back toward his lodgings, James felt a lightness in his step that had nothing to do with the progress of his investigation and everything to do with the extraordinary woman he'd left behind. But his mind was also working furiously, piecing together the final elements of the puzzle. He knew now how the scheme had operated. knew the type of people he was looking for. Tomorrow, he would set his trap, and God help the thieves who had stolen Christmas from innocent children. The game was nearly at an end, and Detective James Sullivan intended to win. The third day of James's investigation dawned cold and clear, with frost coating the windows of his modest apartment near the police precinct. He had spent most of the night finalizing his plan, and now, as the city stirred to life around him, he felt the familiar surge of anticipation that always preceded the closing of a case. But this time, there was something more. A personal stake that went beyond professional pride. He thought of Clara's face, of little Sophie's words about Santa forgetting them, and his resolve hardened into something unbreakable. James dressed carefully, choosing his most authoritative attire, then made his way to the Central Post Office. The postmaster, Mr. Albert Cunningham, was a fastidious man in his 50s who took great pride in the efficiency of his operation. He received James in his office with a mixture of concern and defensiveness, clearly worried that the investigation might reflect poorly on his department. "Detective Sullivan, I assure you that our postal workers are beyond reproach," Cunningham said, gesturing for James to sit. "We run a tight operation here, and any suggestion of impropriety is deeply troubling." "I'm not suggesting your regular employees are involved, Mr. Cunningham," James assured him. "But I need to know about temporary workers, substitutes, anyone who might have had access to mail sorting and delivery over the past 2 months, particularly in the Beacon Hill area." The postmaster's expression shifted from defensive to thoughtful. He rose and retrieved a large ledger from his desk, flipping through pages filled with meticulous records. "We did hire several temporary workers during October and November to handle the increased volume of mail as we approached the holiday season. Let me see here." His finger traced down columns of names and dates. "We had 3 temporary sorters and 2 substitute carriers during that period. I'd like the names and addresses of all 5, James said, his notebook ready. "And specifically, I need to know if any of them worked the Beacon Hill route or had access to mail addressed to St. Catherine's Orphanage." Cunningham's face paled as he continued reading. "Detective, one of our substitute carriers, a Mr. Howard Mitchell, worked the Beacon Hill route for 3 weeks in November. He was let go on December 1st for irregular attendance and complaints about delayed deliveries." The postmaster looked up with dawning horror. "Dear God, do you think he was intercepting mail?" "I think he was part of a larger operation," James said, writing down the information. "Do you have a physical description of this Mr. Mitchell?" "Average height, dark hair, wore spectacles with gold frames," Cunningham recited from memory, then consulted his records. He gave an address on Commercial Street when he applied for the position. "Detective Sullivan, if this man has been using his position here to commit fraud, the Postal Service's reputation will be severely damaged. Your cooperation in catching him will go a long way toward preserving that reputation, Mr. Cunningham," James said, rising from his chair. "I need you to say nothing about this conversation to anyone. If my suspicions are correct, we're dealing with a criminal network that has operated with considerable sophistication. I don't want to alert them that we're closing in." From the post office, James made his way to the offices of the Boston Herald, where a colleague in the journalism department helped him search through back issues of various ladies' magazines. As he suspected, there was no record of any Victoria Hartley writing for any of the publications that circulated in Boston. The woman who had visited St. Catherine's had been an imposter, part of the same criminal enterprise. By early afternoon, James had gathered enough evidence to bring before his captain at the police precinct. Captain Robert Donnelly was a gruff Irishman who had worked his way up from beat cop to commander through sheer determination and an uncanny ability to read people. He listened to James's report with growing interest, occasionally interrupting with sharp questions that demonstrated his keen understanding of criminal behavior. "So you're saying we have a gang that's been systematically gathering intelligence on charitable donations, then intercepting them before they reach their intended recipients," Donnelly summarized when James had finished. "That's a sophisticated operation, Sullivan. These aren't common street thieves." "No, sir, they're not," James agreed. "They're educated, well-spoken, able to move in respectable society without drawing suspicion. I believe the man calling himself Harrison Blackwell is the ringleader, and he has at least 3 accomplices, the woman posing as Victoria Hartley, the postal worker Howard Mitchell, and likely others we haven't identified yet." Donnelly leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. "What's your plan for bringing them in?" I want to set a trap, sir, James said, leaning forward intently. We'll spread word through select channels that a wealthy benefactor is planning to make a substantial donation to St. Catherine's, $500 in cash, to be delivered personally on December 23rd. That's tomorrow. We'll make sure the information reaches our thieves through the same networks they've been using to gather intelligence. When they move to intercept the donation, we'll be waiting. The captain's eyes gleamed with approval. That's good thinking, Sullivan. You'll need backup, of course. I'll assign officers Patterson and McKinley to work with you. But this benefactor, this bait for your trap, who exactly did you have in mind? James met his superior's gaze steadily. I was hoping you might play that role, sir. You have the bearing and presence to be convincing as a wealthy philanthropist, and I trust you to handle yourself if things turn dangerous. Donnelly barked a laugh. Flattery will get you everywhere, detective. All right, I'm in. Brief me on the details, and let's catch these bastards who are stealing from children. They spent the next hour planning every detail of the operation. James would alert certain contacts among the merchant class, people who were known to gossip, letting slip information about the upcoming donation. The news would spread through the commercial district, reaching the ears of anyone who was paying attention to charitable activities in the city. Meanwhile, James and his fellow officers would position themselves around St. Catherine's, ready to move in when the thieves made their attempt. As the winter sun began its early descent, James made his way back to Beacon Hill, his heart quickening as the orphanage came into view. Clara met him at the door, and he could see immediately that she had been watching for his arrival. Her face was flushed with cold and anticipation, her eyes bright with hope. James, I've been anxious all day, she said, ushering him inside. Tell me you've made progress. He followed her to the small office, and once the door was closed, he took both her hands in his, a gesture that now felt natural and right. Clara, I know who's been stealing the donations, and tomorrow we're going to catch them. But I need your help, and I need you to trust me completely. I do trust you, she said without hesitation. Tell me what you need me to do. James explained the plan, watching her face as she absorbed the details. Tomorrow afternoon, Captain Donnelly will arrive here posing as a wealthy benefactor. You and Mrs. Pemberton will receive him as you would any potential donor, give him a tour, discuss the orphanage's needs. We'll have let it be known through certain channels that he's carrying a substantial sum of cash. The thieves will almost certainly make an attempt to intercept him, either here or as he leaves. Clara's grip on his hands tightened. And you'll be here? You'll be waiting for them? I and several other officers will be positioned throughout the building and on the street, James assured her. You'll be perfectly safe, I promise you. But Clara, there's a risk involved, and I need to know that you're comfortable with this plan. If you have any doubts, any concerns, tell me now and we'll find another way. She looked at him for a long moment, her green eyes searching his face, and he felt the intensity of her trust like a physical thing. I'm not afraid, James. Not with you here to protect us. Let's catch these thieves and give the children their Christmas. Her courage and determination moved him deeply, and without thinking, he raised one of her hands to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her fingers. The gesture was intimate, perhaps too forward for their brief acquaintance, but Clara's sharp intake of breath and the soft smile that curved her lips told him she welcomed it. When this is over, he said quietly, still holding her hand against his lips, when the children are celebrating their Christmas and these criminals are behind bars, I want to court you properly, Clara Bennett. I want to take you to dinner, to the theater, to walk with you through the public garden when spring arrives. I've never felt about anyone the way I feel about you, and I need you to know that. Tears sparkled in her eyes, but they were tears of happiness. I've been alone for so long, James, focusing only on the children and my work here. I thought I would never meet someone who understood what this life means to me, who didn't see my past as something shameful. But you look at me and you see me, truly see me, and that means more than you can possibly know. Your past is part of what makes you so extraordinary, James said, releasing her hand reluctantly. You could have become bitter, could have turned away from the world that was so unkind to you. Instead, you dedicated yourself to ensuring that other children in your situation would have someone who cared. That takes remarkable strength and compassion. They were interrupted by a knock on the door, and Mrs. Pemberton entered, her expression curious as she noted their proximity and the emotional charge in the air. Forgive the interruption, but the children are asking after you both. They've heard we have a visitor, and they're curious about the detective who's going to save Christmas. Clara laughed, brushing away her tears. We'll be right there, Mrs. Pemberton. She turned back to James. Would you like to meet them? The children, I mean. They've been asking about you. James felt a moment of uncertainty. He was comfortable in the world of criminals and investigations, but children were an unknown territory. Yet he saw the hope in Clara's eyes and found himself nodding. I'd be honored. They followed Mrs. Pemberton to a large common room where the children had gathered after their lessons. 23 pairs of eyes turned to stare at James as he entered, ranging from the curious gazes of the youngest to the more guarded expressions of the older children who had learned to be wary of strangers. Clara moved among them with easy grace, her hand touching a shoulder here, smoothing hair there, her love for them evident in every gesture. Children, this is Detective Sullivan, she announced. He's working very hard to make sure you all have a wonderful Christmas. A small girl with blonde braids and enormous blue eyes detached herself from the group and approached James with the fearless curiosity of the very young. This, he realized, must be Sophie, the child whose words had so moved Clara. Are you really a detective? She asked, tilting her head to look up at him. Do you catch bad people? James crouched down to her level, bringing his face even with hers. I do catch bad people, Sophie. And right now, I'm working on catching the people who took the money that was meant for your Christmas presents. Her eyes widened. Will you catch them in time? Christmas is only 2 days away. I will catch them, James promised, his voice firm with conviction. And you're going to have the best Christmas St. Catherine's has ever seen. I give you my word. Sophie studied him with the intense scrutiny that only children can muster, then suddenly threw her arms around his neck in an impulsive hug. Thank you, Mr. Detective, she whispered against his collar. Miss Clara has been sad, but when she talks about you, she smiles, so you must be very nice. James felt his throat tighten with emotion as he returned the child's embrace. Over Sophie's shoulder, he saw Clara watching them, her hand pressed to her heart, tears streaming freely down her face now. The other children began to gather around, asking questions, wanting to touch his badge, begging for stories about his investigations. For the next hour, James found himself telling carefully edited tales of his work, delighting in their reactions, feeling something warm and previously unknown unfurling in his chest. Later, as he prepared to leave for the evening, Clara walked him to the door. The orphanage had settled into its nighttime routine, and they could hear Mrs. O'Brien in the kitchen preparing for tomorrow's breakfast, the comfortable domestic sounds that spoke of home and safety. Thank you for spending time with them, Clara said softly. You have no idea what it meant to them, and to me, to see you interact with them so kindly. Many people look at orphans and see only their lack, their poverty. But you looked at them and saw children deserving of respect and care. They're remarkable children, James said honestly, and they have remarkable women caring for them. He reached out and gently cupped her face in his hand, his thumb brushing away a lingering tear. Tomorrow, Clara. Tomorrow we end this, and then we can look toward a future that holds more than just solving crimes and running orphanages. We can look toward a future together, if you'll have me. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing briefly. Yes, James. Whatever tomorrow brings, yes. He wanted to kiss her then, wanted it with an intensity that surprised him, but he knew it wasn't the right time or place. Instead, he pressed his lips to her forehead, a promise of what was to come, then reluctantly stepped out into the cold December night. As he walked home through the gaslit streets, James ran through the plan one more time in his mind, checking for weaknesses, anticipating problems. Everything had to go perfectly tomorrow. The children were counting on him. Clara was counting on him, and he had given his word. Detective James Sullivan always kept his word. Tomorrow would bring justice, he was certain of that. And if the saints were kind, it would also bring the beginning of something wonderful, with the most extraordinary woman he had ever known. December 23rd arrived with a bitter wind that rattled the windows of St. Catherine's and sent swirls of snow dancing through the streets of Boston. James had been awake since before dawn, finalizing arrangements with Captain Donnelly and the other officers who would assist in the operation. Officers Patterson and McKinley were experienced men, veterans of the force who understood the importance of discretion and timing. They had positioned themselves strategically around the orphanage by mid-morning, dressed as ordinary citizens going about their business, blending seamlessly into the neighborhood. James himself had taken up position in the orphanage's small library, a room with a view of both the front entrance and the side door where deliveries were received. Clara had shown him there at first light, her face pale with tension, but her resolve unwavering. She wore a dress of deep green that brought out the color of her eyes, and despite the gravity of the situation, James found himself momentarily distracted by how beautiful she looked. "Are you certain this will work?" she asked quietly, standing close to him as they peered through the lace curtains at the street below. "What if they don't take the bait? What if they've somehow learned it's a trap?" James turned to face her, taking her hands in his to still their trembling. "Clara, I've spent 3 days studying how these people operate. They're methodical, yes, but they're also greedy. The prospect of intercepting $500 will be too tempting for them to resist. They'll come, and when they do, we'll be ready." She nodded, drawing strength from his confidence, then surprised him by rising on her toes and pressing a quick, soft kiss to his cheek. "For luck," she whispered, her breath warm against his skin, "and as a promise that when this is over, we'll have time for more than just stolen moments." Before James could respond, before he could pull her into his arms the way he desperately wanted to, they heard the sound of a carriage approaching. Clara squeezed his hands once more, then hurried from the room to take her position with Mrs. Pemberton in the front parlor. James moved deeper into the shadows of the library, his hand resting on the revolver at his hip, every sense alert. Captain Donnelly arrived precisely on schedule, descending from an elegant carriage with the bearing of a man accustomed to wealth and authority. He wore a fine overcoat with a fur collar, carried a gold-headed walking stick, and projected exactly the image they needed: a prosperous gentleman engaged in charitable work. James watched as Clara and Mrs. Pemberton received him at the door, their performance flawless as they welcomed him with appropriate gratitude and deference. The tour of the orphanage proceeded according to plan. James could hear their voices as they moved through the building, Donnelly asking questions in a cultured accent quite different from his usual gruff Irish brogue, Clara and Mrs. Pemberton responding with genuine emotion as they described the children's needs and the orphanage's financial struggles. The children themselves had been briefed to behave naturally, and their authentic enthusiasm as they met the supposed benefactor added credibility to the charade. An hour passed, then another. James remained at his post, his eyes constantly scanning the street, watching for any sign of the thieves. Several pedestrians passed by, none showing unusual interest in the orphanage. A delivery wagon made its rounds, the driver calling out greetings to neighbors. A woman with a basket hurried past, her shawl pulled tight against the cold. Everything seemed ordinary, normal, and James felt the first stirrings of doubt. Had they miscalculated? Had the thieves somehow learned this was a trap? Then, just as the church bells struck 2 o'clock, he saw them. 2 men approached from opposite directions, their movements carefully casual, but their attention focused on the orphanage. One was middle-aged, well-dressed, wearing spectacles with gold frames and carrying a leather portfolio. Harrison Blackwell, James was certain of it. The other was younger, his clothes less expensive but respectable, a cap pulled low over his dark hair. They met on the corner across from the orphanage, exchanging a few words before separating again. James's pulse quickened. This was it. He moved silently to the hallway, signaling to Officer Patterson, who was positioned near the kitchen. The officer nodded, understanding immediately, and slipped out the back door to alert McKinley and the others. In the front parlor, Captain Donnelly was concluding his visit with elaborate promises of support. "I'll return on Christmas Eve with the full donation," he announced loudly, his voice carrying through the building. $500 in cash as I promised. I want to see the children's faces when they receive their gifts." James heard Clara's voice, warm with manufactured gratitude. "You're extraordinarily generous, Mr. Pemberton. The children will be so grateful. Shall we see you out?" They moved toward the entrance, and James positioned himself where he could see through the doorway without being visible from the street. Donnelly descended the front steps, Clara and Mrs. Pemberton waving from the doorway before closing it against the cold. The captain climbed into his carriage, which began to move slowly down the street. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the 2 men James had spotted earlier began to move, following the carriage at a discreet distance. But they weren't the only ones. From a doorway across the street emerged a woman in an elegant coat, her face partially obscured by a fashionable hat. Victoria Hartley, or whatever her real name was. And from an alley came a fourth figure, younger than the others, nervous energy evident in his hurried steps. The entire gang was mobilizing. James burst from the library calling for Clara. "Stay inside. Lock the doors. Don't open them for anyone but me or the other officers." He didn't wait for her response, racing out the front door and down the steps, his badge held high. "Police, stop where you are!" The effect was immediate and chaotic. The woman screamed and tried to run, but Officer McKinley emerged from his hiding place in a doorway and caught her before she'd gone 3 steps. The younger man, whom James now recognized from the description as Howard Mitchell, the corrupt postal worker, attempted to flee down an alley but ran straight into Officer Patterson, who had circled around behind. That left the 2 leaders, Blackwell and his older accomplice, who turned to face James with expressions that shifted rapidly from shock to calculation to resignation. "It's over, Blackwell," James called out, his revolver drawn but pointed at the ground. "Or should I call you by your real name? We know everything. The fake identities, the intercepted mail, the stolen donations. You and your associates are under arrest for theft and fraud." The man with the spectacles straightened his shoulders, maintaining his dignity even in defeat. "I don't know what you're talking about, Detective. My name is Harrison Blackwell, and I'm simply out for an afternoon walk." "Your name is Theodore Marsh," James said coldly, moving closer. He had spent the previous evening searching through police records and had finally found a match. "You were arrested in Philadelphia 3 years ago for a similar scheme, stealing from church collections. The charges were dropped due to lack of evidence, but I have all the evidence I need this time. The postal worker who's been intercepting mail for you has already confessed everything in exchange for leniency." This was a bluff, as Mitchell hadn't yet said a word, but James saw the flicker of fear in Marsh's eyes. The older man beside him, who had remained silent until now, suddenly broke. "I told you this was a mistake, Theodore. I told you we should have left Boston weeks ago. Stealing from orphans, for God's sake, what were we thinking?" "Shut up, Albert," Marsh snapped. But it was too late. The admission had been heard by all the officers present, and Captain Donnelly, who had returned with his carriage, was climbing down to formally place them under arrest. Within minutes, all 4 criminals were in custody, their hands bound, their schemes unraveled. Officers Patterson and McKinley led them away toward the police wagons that had been standing by, while Captain Donnelly approached James with an expression of satisfaction. "Well done, Sullivan," the captain said, clapping him on the shoulder. "That was as clean an operation as I've ever seen. The district attorney will have no trouble prosecuting this case, not with all the evidence you've gathered and the confession we just heard." "Thank you, sir," James said, but his attention was already turning back to the orphanage, where he could see Clara standing in the doorway, her hand pressed to her heart, tears streaming down her face. "With your permission, Captain, I'd like to inform Miss Bennet and Mrs. Pemberton that the matter is resolved." Donnelly's stern face softened with understanding. "Go on then. You've earned it. But Sullivan, one more thing." He reached into his coat and withdrew a thick envelope. "This is the real reason I volunteered to play the benefactor. Inside is $500 from the Police Benevolent Fund. Every officer in the precinct contributed when they heard what these bastards had done. The children of St. Catherine's are going to have their Christmas after all." James felt his throat tighten with emotion as he accepted the envelope. "Sir, I don't know what to say. This is extraordinarily generous. Say Merry Christmas, Detective, and go tell that young lady what we've accomplished here today," Donnelly replied with a rare smile. "And Sullivan, when you ask her to marry you, and I know you will, you have my blessing. Any woman who dedicates her life to helping children deserves a good man, and you're one of the best I know." James climbed the steps to the orphanage, where Clara met him at the door. Without a word, she threw her arms around him, and he held her tightly, feeling her tears soak through his coat, her body trembling against his. "It's over," he murmured into her hair. "They're all in custody, and the children are going to have their Christmas." She pulled back just enough to look up at him, her face radiant despite the tears. "I knew you would do it. I never doubted you for a moment." Mrs. Pemberton appeared behind Clara, her own eyes suspiciously bright. "Detective Sullivan, what you've done for these children, for all of us, there are no words adequate to express our gratitude." "There's more," James said, holding up the envelope Captain Donnelly had given him. "The officers of the Boston Police Department have taken up a collection, $500 for the children's Christmas." Clara's hand flew to her mouth, and Mrs. Pemberton actually gasped. $500? The older woman repeated. Detective Sullivan, that's more than we could have hoped for. The children will have everything they need and more. May I see them? James asked. I'd like to tell them personally that Christmas is saved. The children were gathered in the common room, having heard the commotion outside, but kept safely indoors as instructed. When James entered with Clara and Mrs. Pemberton, they surged forward, their faces filled with questions and hope. Little Sophie pushed her way to the front, her blonde braids bouncing, her blue eyes wide. Mr. Detective, did you catch the bad people? She asked breathlessly. James crouched down, just as he had before, bringing himself to her level. I did, Sophie. I caught all of them, and they're going to jail where they can't hurt anyone else. And I have even better news. He looked around at all the eager young faces surrounding him. You're all going to have the Christmas you deserve. Thanks to some very kind police officers, we have enough money for new shoes, warm coats, a beautiful Christmas dinner, and presents for every single one of you. The room erupted in cheers and shouts of joy. Children jumped up and down, hugged each other, some of the older ones openly weeping with relief and happiness. Sophie launched herself at James, wrapping her small arms around his neck with such enthusiasm that he nearly toppled backward. I knew you would do it, she cried. I told everyone that Miss Clara's detective would save Christmas, and I was right. Over the child's shoulder, James met Clara's eyes, and what he saw there took his breath away. It wasn't just gratitude or relief, though both were present. It was love, pure and simple, shining from her with an intensity that made his heart race. She mouthed 2 words, thank you, and then more quietly, I love you. The afternoon dissolved into celebration. Mrs. O'Brien emerged from the kitchen with fresh-baked cookies, a treat she had been saving for Christmas but decided the occasion warranted. The children danced and sang, their joy infectious and absolute. Mrs. Pemberton sat in her chair with tears running unashamedly down her weathered cheeks, and even the normally reserved cook was smiling broadly. As evening approached and the children were called to dinner, Clara drew James aside to the small office where their acquaintance had begun, just 3 days earlier. It seemed impossible that he had known her for such a short time. She had become essential to him, woven into his heart in a way that felt permanent and right. James, she began, but he placed a gentle finger on her lips. Let me speak first, he said softly. Clara, I know we've known each other only a few days, and convention would say I should wait, should court you properly before saying what I'm about to say. But I've spent my entire adult life dealing with criminals, with the worst humanity has to offer, and it's made me cynical about people and their motives. Then I met you, and everything changed. You reminded me that there is genuine goodness in this world, that there are people who dedicate themselves to helping others without thought of reward. You're extraordinary, Clara Bennett, and I'm hopelessly, completely in love with you. Fresh tears spilled down her cheeks, but she was smiling, that radiant smile that transformed her already beautiful face into something luminous. I love you too, James. I think I started falling in love with you the moment you walked through that door, and I saw the determination in your eyes. You could have treated this as just another case, just another job, but you made it personal. You saw the children as I see them, as precious individuals deserving of protection and care. How could I not love you for that? James cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gently wiping away her tears. I know I should ask permission to court you, that there are proper procedures to follow, but Clara, I need to know. When this case is closed, when the paperwork is filed and the criminals are sentenced, will you consider becoming my wife? Not immediately. We can take whatever time you need. But eventually, will you marry me and let me spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of you? Yes, she breathed, the word barely audible but carrying more weight than any speech. Yes, James, absolutely yes. I don't need time to know my own heart. I've been alone for so long, convinced I would spend my life caring for these children and never have a family of my own. But now I can have both. We can have both, if you're willing to accept that St. Catherine's will always be part of my life. I wouldn't want it any other way, James assured her. These children need you, and they'll have both of us. We'll build a life together that includes them, that honors the work you do here. I promise you that. Unable to resist any longer, James lowered his head and kissed her, a gentle press of lips that quickly deepened as Clara rose on her toes and wrapped her arms around his neck. It was a kiss that spoke of promises and hope, of a future they would build together, of love that had found them both when they least expected it. When they finally broke apart, breathless and smiling, Clara rested her forehead against his chest. "The children are going to be so excited. Sophie has already decided you're her favorite person after me. She'll probably want you to come to every holiday and birthday celebration from now on." "I'll be at everyone," James promised, holding her close. "This is my family now, too, if you'll have me." The sound of children's laughter drifted from the dining room, and Clara took James's hand, interlacing their fingers. "Come, let's join them for dinner. It's not every day we have a hero in our midst." They walked together down the hallway, hand in hand, and as they entered the dining room, the children erupted in fresh cheers. Mrs. Pemberton had clearly told them about the engagement, because Sophie came running up with a handful of wildflowers that had somehow survived the December cold, pressing them into Clara's free hand. "These are for your wedding," the little girl announced proudly. Every bride needs flowers. The dinner was the most joyful James had ever attended. He sat beside Clara at the long table, surrounded by children who peppered him with questions about police work, who begged for stories, who had already accepted him as part of their family. Mrs. Pemberton presided over the meal with quiet satisfaction, and Mrs. O'Brien kept bringing out more food, insisting that a man of James's size needed proper feeding. As the evening wore on and the children were finally sent to bed, James and Clara stood together at the front window, watching snow begin to fall softly over the city. Christmas was just hours away now, and the orphanage was finally ready for it, thanks to the generosity of the police officers and the resolution of the case. "I was thinking," Clara said softly, leaning against his shoulder, "perhaps we could be married in the spring, when the gardens are in bloom and the weather is warm. The children could all attend, and we could have the ceremony here, in the orphanage chapel. Would that suit you?" "That sounds perfect," James replied, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "Though I confess, waiting until spring seems like an eternity." She laughed, the sound like music. "We've waited this long to find each other, James Sullivan. We can wait a few more months to do things properly." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the snow blanket the city in white, each lost in thoughts of the future that stretched before them. James thought of the home they would make together, of the children they might have of their own someday, of growing old beside this remarkable woman who had captured his heart so completely. "Clara," he said quietly, "do you remember what Sophie said to you? About being good, but Santa forgetting them?" "I'll never forget it," Clara replied. "It broke my heart. Tell her tomorrow, when she wakes up, that Santa didn't forget them after all. Tell her that sometimes Santa works in mysterious ways, and that this year he worked through a detective who fell in love with her teacher." Clara turned in his arms, looking up at him with eyes full of love. "She'll like that story, they all will, and so will I, for the rest of my life." On Christmas morning, St. Catherine's orphanage was transformed. The donated money had been put to immediate use, and the children woke to find new shoes lined up by their beds, warm coats hanging on hooks, and a Christmas tree in the common room decorated with candles and handmade ornaments. Mrs. O'Brien had prepared a feast that would have impressed the finest hotels in Boston, and there were presents for everyone, carefully chosen to suit each child's interests and needs. James arrived early, unable to stay away, and found Clara already awake and supervising the final preparations. She wore a new dress, deep red like holly berries, and her hair was arranged with particular care. When she saw him, her face lit up with such joy that he felt his breath catch. "Merry Christmas, my love," she said, coming to greet him with a kiss that was both proper and full of promise. "Merry Christmas, Clara," he replied, holding her close. "Are you ready for the chaos?" As if in answer, they heard the thunder of small feet on the stairs, and suddenly the orphanage was filled with shrieks of delight as the children discovered their gifts. Sophie found James immediately, dragging him by the hand to see the beautiful doll she had received with a porcelain face and real hair. "Look, Mr. Detective, Santa did remember us. You were right." James swept the little girl up in his arms, his heart full to bursting. "Santa always remembers good children, Sophie, always." The day passed in a blur of happiness. The children played with their new toys, tried on their new clothes, and devoured Mrs. O'Brien's magnificent dinner with enthusiasm. Captain Donnelly stopped by in the afternoon, bringing additional gifts from the police force, and stayed for cake and coffee. He pulled James aside at one point, gripping his shoulder firmly. "You did good work here, Sullivan. Real good work. The district attorney tells me that Marsh and his accomplices will be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. They'll be spending several years in prison, thinking about the children they tried to rob. Thank you, sir, James said. And thank you for the personal contribution you made. It meant the world to these children. Donnelly's gruff expression softened. I was an orphan myself once upon a time. Ended up on the streets until a police officer took an interest in me, helped me find my way. That's why I became a cop, to help others the way I was helped. These children will remember this Christmas for the rest of their lives, Sullivan, and that's worth more than any amount of money. As evening fell and the children finally began to tire from their excitement, Clara and James found themselves once again in the small office, stealing a few moments of privacy. The day had been perfect, everything they could have hoped for, and James felt a contentment he had never experienced before. Thank you, Clara said softly, her head resting on his shoulder. Thank you for saving Christmas, for catching the thieves, for loving me and the children. Thank you for everything. Thank you for showing me what it means to have a family, James replied, holding her close. For teaching me that love isn't something to be feared or avoided, but something to be embraced. You've changed my life, Clara Bennett, in the space of just a few days. Soon to be Clara Sullivan, she reminded him with a smile. If you haven't changed your mind about making an honest woman of me. Never, he promised fiercely. You're stuck with me now, for better or worse, in sickness and in health, from this day forward. That sounds suspiciously like a marriage vow, Detective Sullivan, she teased, but her eyes were serious, full of love and commitment. Practice, he said, pressing a kiss to her forehead. I want to get it right when the time comes. They remained there as darkness fell completely, the orphanage settling into peaceful quiet around them, the children finally asleep after the most exciting day of their young lives. Outside, snow continued to fall, blanketing the city in pristine white, and somewhere in the distance, church bells rang out the end of Christmas Day. James thought back to that moment 3 days ago when he had first climbed the steps of St. Catherine's, a detective with a case to solve and nothing more. He had had no idea that he was walking toward his future, toward the woman who would become his wife, toward a family he never knew he needed. Life, he reflected, had a way of surprising you when you least expected it. What are you thinking about? Clara asked, sensing his contemplative mood. I'm thinking that this has been the best Christmas of my life, James replied honestly, and I'm thinking that every Christmas from now on will be even better, because I'll be spending them with you. Clara lifted her head to look at him, her green eyes reflecting the firelight. We were good this year, and Santa didn't forget us after all, she said softly, echoing little Sophie's words but giving them new meaning. He brought us each other. The best gift I could have received, James agreed and kissed her again, sealing the promise of all their Christmases to come. In the years that followed, James and Clara Sullivan would indeed build the life they had dreamed of that Christmas night. They married in the spring of 1898, with all 23 children of St. Catherine's in attendance, and James formally became part of the orphanage's extended family. He continued his work as a detective, building an impressive career, but he always made time for the children, teaching them, protecting them, loving them as his own. Clara continued her work at St. Catherine's, but now she had a partner in all things, someone who understood and supported her dedication to helping those in need. Together, they would eventually have 3 children of their own, but the orphanage children remained an integral part of their family, invited to every celebration, supported in every endeavor. And every Christmas Eve, James would tell the story of how he met their mother, how he came to St. Catherine's to catch some thieves, and ended up finding love instead. The children never tired of hearing it, and neither did Clara, who would always add at the end, and we lived happily ever after, just like in the fairy tales, because they did.